Hello and welcome to The View from 22. I'm John Connolly, the Spectator's news editor. Today we're talking about the planned Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russia. And joining me to discuss is Dmitry Alperovich, national security expert and co-founder of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. Hi Dmitry, thank you for joining us. Now, we've been hearing about for a long time now about a planned Ukrainian counteroffensive, the idea being that after holding the Russians back throughout the winter, Ukraine could now begin potentially to push back and try and take back some of that land. So what's the situation looking like there at the moment in eastern Ukraine?
Well, very likely this offensive has already begun. And I think a lot of people have had unreasonable expectations about this offensive. They've been thinking that this would be sort of a lightning strike, similar to what the Ukrainians did last year in the Kharkiv Oblast in the north, where within a couple of days they were able to get thousands of square kilometers of territory. And that's just not going to be the case very likely. It's much more likely that this is going to be more like the Kherson campaign, which lasted many months, which was a highly attritional fight with a lot of artillery shaping campaigns against Russian forces and very slow progress until they were able to finally kick the Russians out. The Russians are expecting, of course, this counteroffensive. They've been preparing for it. They've been building defensive fortifications. So what the Ukrainians are doing right now is really shaping operations. You see some minor operations that they're doing near Bakhmut, and those are likely to an attempt to distract Russian forces, maybe to bring some reinforcements from other areas where the Ukrainians are much more likely to strike.
It seems a bit like we've seen the Ukrainians playing down a bit some of the counteroffensive talk. I mean, the land we're talking about here, it's about the size of the UK that Russia still holds in Ukraine. I mean, how much of that do you think they could really take back?
Well, look, I think it all depends on how prepared they are, but also it all depends on how prepared the Russians are. In fact, when you look at the successes that the Ukrainians have had thus far, whether it was in the Battle of Kiev, whether it was in the Battle of Kharkiv, whether it was in the Battle of Kherson, those successes, and I don't want to take anything away from the bravery and the brilliance of the Ukrainian forces, but they were largely a result of the Russians being woefully unprepared for the fight. In Kiev Oblast, they didn't have logistics, they didn't have the forces to take Kiev, they had to withdraw. In Kharkiv Oblast, they were severely undermanned, and the Ukrainians saw that and took advantage of that. And of course, in Kherson, they were on the other side of the river. The Ukrainians were able to blow their bridges, and they were not able to supply their forces. Those easy wins are gone now, so the Russians are much better prepared. But again, if they make major strategic mistakes, if they fall for a trap that the Ukrainians may set for them and redirect their forces and weaken their front lines, then the Ukrainians are going to be able to make some major gains.
And we saw the announcement last week that the UK are sending long-range missiles to Ukraine. I think the Shadow missile system they're called, which have an even longer range. I mean, do you think that kind of thing can make a difference?
I think it's certainly going to help. One of the things that the Russians have done fairly well in recent months is they've adjusted to the HIMARS weapons, the long-range rocket launch systems that the U.S. had provided last summer, by pushing back their logistics hubs outside of the range of HIMARS. Now those logistics are once again in range with the Storm Shadows being provided by the UK. But the issue with the Storm Shadows is it's a very expensive system, over 700,000 per missile, and there are relatively few of them. So the Ukrainians are going to need to be very thoughtful about the targets they choose to hit, and make sure that they're really going to be able to hit the right targets with those missiles, because they just don't have enough of them.
There's a story in the Washington Post as well saying that Zelensky is perhaps considering strikes inside the Russian mainland. I mean, do you think that's something that we might see?
Well, the Ukrainians have clearly been striking the Russian positions back in Russia for quite some time now, and I'm fairly convinced that the drone attack on the Kremlin a few weeks ago was not a false flag operation. It was a Ukrainian operation. We've seen a number of other drone strikes by the Ukrainians against Russian forces, Russian airfields, not just in Crimea and other occupied territories, but in Russia itself. That's going to continue, but Zelensky has committed to the U.S. and the allies that he will not use Western weapons to do so. So I think he's likely to hold to that promise.
And when Zelensky was in the UK, he mentioned as well, I should add, that he's very keen to have some jets, which the UK is supportive of, and even if not giving them individually. I mean, do you think that air support could make the difference, and do you think he's likely to get them?
So the key question about the jets, and the Ukrainians clearly need them because the Russian Soviet era MiGs that they're flying right now are outgunned by the Russians. They are also very stressed. They've been flying them in very stressful missions, very low to the ground. So those airframes are really getting worn out. Now they've gotten some more MiGs from Eastern European countries or formerly part of the Warsaw Bloc. So that's going to help. But they really need Western jets, and sooner rather than later. There's been a lot of talk about F-16s, and there are challenges with the F-16s. It's a complicated jet to do logistics for. It requires relatively pristine runways. There's questions about which missiles you can fit on F-16s that the U.S. would actually be willing to export, and potentially have China reverse engineer those missiles and impact our readiness in the Indo-Pacific. A much better jet would be the Saab Gripen from Sweden. Sweden doesn't have a lot of them, but Czechoslovakia has a number of them that they could potentially donate if they get other jets to compensate, like the F-16s, and they're trying to buy the F-35, so maybe there's an opportunity to accelerate that. That would be a much better jet, but they need something because the reality is that the air defenses that they have are getting stressed to their limits. The number of interceptors that they have is also running out. So you really need to make sure that the Russians do not establish air superiority over the skies of Ukraine, and jets are going to be critical to that.
Do you think that's something they need for this particular summer offensive, or do you think it's more a long-term concern?
Well, I thought that they needed it yesterday, not necessarily for the summer offensive, because the reality is you're not going to have Ukrainians really have effective supportive ground forces with these jets, just like the Russians have not been able to do so in their campaigns, because the country is littered on both sides with very effective air defenses. So the goal of the jets is not necessarily to support land forces, but to keep the Russians from establishing air superiority over the skies of Ukraine, to keep the Russian Air Force at bay. That's really the main thing that you're trying to accomplish there. So far, they still have some air defenses operational, and obviously the Patriots and the NASAMS that have come in from the West are helpful there as well. They're using a lot of them to intercept these missiles that are targeting Kyiv and other cities. So that's a main issue that they have to decide where to put those air defenses. Do you put them closer to the front line? Do you put them near the cities where some strategic and civilian targets are getting hit by the Russians? It's a really tough dilemma for them, and that's where the jets can help.
And stepping back for a second, do you think there's a bit of a risk here with the counteroffensive in Ukraine, in that if they don't make the gains that perhaps their Western allies have expected, that there might in turn be less Western support in future because they'll be thinking, why should we send weapons to a campaign that's not working? Do you think that's troubling Zelensky and other leaders in Kiev?
I think that one of the things that Putin is absolutely counting on is that the West, both the United States and European allies, are going to get tired of this campaign. They're going to run out of stocks of munitions to supply to the Ukrainians. In the time of austerity measures, once again, in the United States, there's going to be less appetite to send tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine. And I think that position is going to be even more prominent if the Ukrainians do not show some major gains on the front line. It's a terrible position that they're in, but the reality is that if the campaign grinds to a halt, the aid will not necessarily disappear, will never go to zero, but the big packages that they've been getting up to this point will likely start dwindling to nothing.
And we should talk a little bit about the Russian side of this, because this week we've seen a remarkable story in the Washington Post, which said that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner mercenary service, according to leaks from US intelligence, was speaking to the Ukrainians about and offering to give them Russian troop positions in exchange for them removing troops from Bakhmut, where his mercenaries are fighting. I mean, what did you make of that story? Do you think it's credible, or what did you make of it?
Well, I won't comment on classified information. I'm not privy to whether that is true or not, but I'll tell you this, that certainly Prigozhin is playing his own game here. He doesn't necessarily care about Russian regular forces. He wants to get victories under his belt in Ukraine itself. The prize for him is taking Bakhmut, which, by and large, he's already mostly taken. He's got maybe a dozen or so buildings left to take that the Ukrainians are still defending in the city. He wants to take that so that he can go back to Putin and say, see, I'm the only one that is actually victorious in this campaign. The regular forces led by General Gerasimov, the head of the general staff, and Shoigu, the defense minister, are screwing up. They're losing territory. I'm gaining territory, and use that as an opportunity to try to gain more power inside Russia. Maybe he has his own desires on running the Ministry of Defense one day, although I don't think it's very realistic. But that's the play that he's orchestrating here. So I'm not surprised that he would be willing to sell anyone and everyone to try to accomplish that.
I mean, if that report is credible, what do you think Putin would make of that?
Well, that report is already getting discredited in the Russian media. So I think that Putin is just going to assume that this is U.S. propaganda. So I don't think it's going to impact Prigozhin at all in his position in Russia.
And one of Prigozhin's earlier complaints was that the defense ministry in particular wasn't supplying him with enough ammunition. Has that kind of been resolved now, do you think?
He's still complaining about it, but I'll tell you, talking to the Ukrainians on the ground in Bakhmut, they're getting hit by a lot of artillery systems, a lot of munitions and shells coming down on their positions. So Prigozhin may be complaining and he may want more, but they're already outgunning Ukrainians, 3 or 4 to 1 in terms of the artillery shells that they're firing. So, they still have quite a lot, and Bakhmut is largely a destroyed city right now. This is not unlike the regular type of warfare that Russia conducts. If you look at Grozny in Chechnya, the capital of Chechnya, was completely leveled to the ground in the early 2000s. Of course, cities in Syria like Aleppo have been destroyed by Russian bombing strikes. So they're just replaying that old playbook.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like, I think a few months ago, there was a lot of talk, there was a lot of worry and concern from the West that Ukraine was expending too many lives and resources defending Bakhmut. Do you still agree with that kind of assessment? Do you think they maybe should have let it go and consolidated this elsewhere? Or do you think they've been successful at holding the Russians off until now?
Well, look, I think it's really hard to criticize them on these tactical decisions because they're there, we're not. They have to make the decisions that are right for them. We don't have the complete information. And the other element of this is that, let's say they withdrew from Bakhmut, they would still have to fight the Russians somewhere. So they would still face the attrition that they're experiencing on their own forces, on their own munitions. So whether it's Bakhmut or something else, that fight would still go on.
So turning now to sort of the bit of the Russian strategy, over the summer, what are their main aims now? Is it just to kind of hold the lines, or do you think they'll be hoping to push the Ukrainians elsewhere?
Yeah, this is a little bit like chess now, where each side gets to play a move and then wait for the other side to respond. So the Russians have had their offensive, which really hasn't gained them much at all. Maybe they'll finish it by taking those few remaining buildings in Bakhmut, probably destroying them. And then they'll sit and wait and respond to the Ukrainian counterattack. Depending on how successful the Ukrainians are, that could either change everything or get us back into a position where maybe some territory changed, but fundamentally the strategic position of both sides has not changed. And then Putin will have a decision to make because he does not have the forces right now to launch another counteroffensive. And to do so, he will have to do another major mobilization drives, clearly something that he has been resistant to do and something that has real political cost to him. But he's also very committed to this fight, so I would not put it past him sometime this summer or in the fall to actually call it up. And one of the things that he's got now is these laws that have been passed by the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament, that make it much easier for him to prevent draft dodging and to call up people because now they don't even have to notify people in person. They can do so electronically through government systems that they regularly interact with, and that gives them a lot more flexibility.
So we've already had sort of one round of Russian mobilization. We've also had mercenary groups like Wagner using prisoners and so on in Ukraine. I mean, how successful has that been for Russia? Is it just sort of throwing bodies at the problem, and because they've got a larger population, they can get away with it, do you think? Or has there been some success to it?
Well, there are different elements here. I think Wagner has actually been a more effective force, not necessarily because of the convicts that they've thrown at the front line. Those have been basically meat to be to fed into the grinder there. But the rest of the Wagner is actually a fairly professionalized force comprised of former military personnel that have had experience in Syria, have had experience in Africa and Libya and elsewhere, and previously in Ukraine itself. So they've done fairly well, and the Ukrainians actually have talked about how Wagner presents a major challenge to them. The mobilized personnel in the regular army have done much less well, and in part because the training has been very limited. But the Ukrainians are facing the same problem now. The reality is that on both sides now, this is a war of the mobilized. The people with experience in warfighting on both sides have either died or been wounded and taken out of action. And now you have people that don't have that much experience. On the Ukrainian side, they are sending people to the West, but it's only 4 to 6 weeks of training. It's not a lot to train someone to do combined arms operations. And if you're trying to do complex offensive operations, I think both sides are going to be challenged in that area. But defensive operations are certainly much easier, and I think both sides still have capabilities there.
Presumably, Ukraine must be more worried than Russia that if this counteroffensive goes badly and they lose a lot of men, then they're going to really struggle to replenish that because with a small population, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainians still have millions of people that they can call up as well, but certainly they have to worry about the impact of their economy. The economy has experienced over 40% GDP decline in the last year. The Russian economy experienced only 2% GDP decline. So they can't call up every able-bodied men in Ukraine to the front line because what is going to remain of their economy. So they have to be thoughtful about this. But this is really the biggest problem for Ukraine right now is that people don't always appreciate that Ukrainian victory and Russian victory are two different things entirely. Russia doesn't have to win. It just needs to not lose. And Ukraine actually needs to win. It needs to take back the territory that is lost and kick Russia out. And that's much, much harder to do than for the Russians to try to hang on to what they've taken.
That brings us on nicely to my final question, which is that say if this counteroffensive isn't as successful as some might hope, the lines that, Russia's lines don't get pushed back that much. They hold on to a substantial amount of Ukrainian territory. Do you think we're going to see greater calls for Ukraine to come to the negotiating table and negotiate with Russia?
Well, you're already seeing that. I'm here in Europe this week and talking to Europeans across the continent. A lot of them are wondering, when is Ukraine going to start negotiating? The problem with that position is that they don't have anyone to negotiate with. There's zero indication that Putin is at all interested in negotiating. I think he's certainly looking at the election calendar next year in the United States, where he may expect potentially an administration to come to power that may be less interested in helping Ukraine. He's also looking at the munitions supplies in the West that are dwindling, particularly artillery and air defense interceptors, and is hoping that that's going to change his fortunes. So the idea that he's going to make some major concessions to Ukraine in the negotiations at this moment,
they are consistently the
Brilliant.
most
Thank you very much,
likely
Dimitri.
to unfriend,
Thank you.
block, and insult people who hold different beliefs to their own. Hello and welcome to Russia Matters with me, Winston Marshall at The Spectator in London. Today I'm joined by Matt Goodwin, Professor of Politics at the University of Kent and author of 4 books, including Sunday Times bestseller National Populism and his most recent book, Values, Voice and Virtue, The New British Politics, which I finished this weekend, and explores the change in politics from the onset of hyper-globalization with Margaret Thatcher through to the populist revolts of the 2010s. And he spoke recently at the National Conservative Conference around the corner, the Emmanuel Centre.
I'm sorry for ruining your weekend.
Well, Matt, thank you for coming to speak with me.
No worries.
I'd like to speak about your books and the National Conservative Conference, which, as we speak now, is kind of, I think we're maybe on the tail end of a big Twitter flare-up with some of, particularly it seems to have aggravated the people that you describe as the cosmopolitans in your recent book. And I'm curious also to speak to you about the Conservative Party legacy and future, the Labour Party, where they are, and various things like immigration that tie in all of these things. But I thought perhaps before going into that, for people who haven't yet read the book, if you might just lay out your sort of theory about traditionalists and cosmopolitans, and how those movements sort of underlie British politics.
Yeah, sure. And I think in a sense, the conference also speaks to that question and why the conference happened. I wrote this book because I wanted to explain why Britain has been upended over the last decade by what I see as three interconnected but quite distinct rebellions. You had the rise of populism, national populism with Nigel Farage, which obviously outflanked a lot of people. They didn't see it coming. You then had the vote for Brexit, again, outflanked much of the establishment. And then you had that post-Brexit realignment with Boris Johnson and the Conservatives in 2019, right? That seemed to usher in this new brand of conservative politics. And what I wanted to do in the book is really say, well, how on earth have we got here? Why on earth did all of that happen? And why are so many people frustrated and disillusioned with the state of the country? And one of the things that I personally felt very frustrated about was how we've been given many unconvincing narratives about why all of that happened. We've been told it's social media, we've been told it's Russia, it's individual donors, it's campaigners, it's what was written on the side of a big red bus. And in the book, really what I say is actually, if you take a step back and look at Britain, in fact, if you look at most Western democracies, what I would argue is these rebellions really reflect, an understandable response to the rise of a new elite within our societies who are no longer reflecting the values that are held by millions of people, who are no longer giving those people a sufficient voice in the institutions, and who are now embracing a very divisive ideology of radical progressivism, which views some groups as having virtue, as having status, as having a sense of moral righteousness, but other groups as actually being seen as inferior, as being seen as backward, as being seen as problematic in some way or other. And I think one of the key points about Britain today is that the new elite are united, unlike the old elite, by a set of liberal cosmopolitan views. And by that, I mean they're much more aggressively pro-immigration. They're much more supportive of returning Britain to the European Union. They're much more universalist in how they think about identity. So they're not really interested in Britain's distinctive identity, history, and culture, which millions of people really do cherish. They want to keep Britain distinct. The new elite is really much more interested in reshaping our national identity around international themes like diversity or multiculturalism. And as I said at the conference, there's nothing wrong in saying that Britain is welcoming and diverse, but diversity cannot be the basis of our national identity, because it's like saying we don't have an identity of our own. Mm-hmm. And many people out there clearly feel that we do have an identity that's worth preserving. So my message essentially is that unless we can somehow close these gaps, unless we can somehow get people to develop shared values, or at least respect the fact that people hold different values and they're just as legitimate and just as acceptable as those that are in the corridors of power, and unless we can give people more of a voice in the national conversation, in the media, in the creative industries, in the cultural institutions, in the universities, in the schools, we're going to have bigger problems ahead, basically, is my conclusion. That what we've seen in the 2010s, I think it's tempting to say, well, that's all over. Now we're back to normal. The adults are back in charge. I have a different view, actually. I think in a way we could yet come to look at the 2010s as the beginning of a much more volatile period in British politics, where people are trying to push back and trying to reassert who they are and what they believe in.
Well, what sort of immediately jumped out to me is the idea that that things are going in a certain direction, even or have come in a linear direction, as you've described it, even if they may go in a very different direction, as you suggest there. What I couldn't quite add up was that I think that the British vote is actually far more capricious. And of course, Labour under Corbyn did very bad in 2019, but not so badly in 2017, which I don't think you address in the book. And now it looks like almost certainly the next government will be Keir Starmer's Labour Party. And so it seems to me that the idea that voters or the traditionalists that you describe are out of touch with the cosmopolitans who have taken over the Labour Party doesn't quite add up, because I think that the traditionalists will end up voting for those cosmopolitans running the Labour Party at the next election.
Well, some of them will, but I think if you look at where many people in Britain are today, I think going back to 2019 briefly is useful. All political realignments are about demand and supply. So voters are demanding a certain response to some issues, and parties are supplying that demand with a credible message and leader. And that's basically what Boris Johnson did. It's what Johnson and Farage did in a referendum. Partly, it's also what Blair did in the late 90s and the early 2000s. What's happened since 2019, however, is that the Conservative Party is no longer supplying that demand with a message that is capable of mobilizing many of those traditionalist voters. So what we've seen is many of those voters abandoning politics altogether. So to give you some evidence for that, when Johnson came in, this is a remarkable statistic, but the Conservatives had 76% of all Brexit voters. All 76%, 3/4 were voting Conservative. When Liz Truss left office, that was down to about 35%. So the realignment that was around Brexit but was never just about Brexit. It was about traditionalism. It was about, let's leave the EU, let's lower migration, let's put Britain first, let's prioritise the national community, British workers. That realignment had completely been blown apart. Now, some of those voters have gone to Labour, partly because Keir Starmer's done quite a good job at sort of moving back to the centre. He's actually talked about accepting Brexit. He's talked about prioritising British jobs. He's done an interesting announcement recently on housing and saying, actually, is it right that we have so many investors from outside of Britain exploiting and contributing to our housing crisis? So there's been a bit of a movement on the supply side for Labour. But the bigger issue in British politics today is we no longer have a political movement that is pitching loudly and credibly to the millions of voters who are basically saying, I want cultural security or cultural freedom from woke progressivism, mass immigration, hyperglobalization, but I also want economic security, right? I want this economy to be reshaped. I don't want it to just be dependent on London and financial services. I want it to be serving the wider community. And I think that what you saw both at the NatCon conference and what you saw through the realignment is really an expression of that desire for something different, for something much more in tune with where voters are. And just on 2017, because it is a really interesting point, Jeremy Corbyn was actually, whatever your personal view of Corbyn, he was quite interesting for a number of reasons. One is he too reflected the utter disillusionment with the established parties. And we forget this. Mm-hmm. Corbyn was a populist. I mean, I would view Corbyn as a left populist. Mm-hmm. He was a populist. He was somebody new. He was authentic. You might disagree with his beliefs, but he was authentic. And on the economy, on the economic axis of politics, he was actually where a lot of voters were. He was saying, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks with the water companies, he was saying, look, don't trust these companies to serve the national interest. We should nationalize them. You can't trust these large companies to deliver on the national interest, and you can't trust banks and financial services to always reform capitalism. Now, I don't agree with his answers, but in raising those questions, he resonated actually with many of the same voters that I'm talking about, voters who have, to be blunt, have been left behind by the economic transformation of the country and are now looking at all of these cultural things that are happening, and they're saying, I'm not even in this conversation anymore. The people in Westminster are just kind of imposing this project top down. And so all realignments are about demand and supply. We've got lots of demand out there, but not much supply.
You mentioned the cultural stuff, and this is something I want to get my head around. But do you really think that the radical progressive cultural push, it really matters to voters as much as the housing crisis, various economic problems, cost of living, inflation? Do people give a damn about the trans issue, for example? Actually, when it comes to the voting, it's like, actually, at the moment, I can't really afford to live.
So the first thing I would say is it's not either or, right? Voters will typically think about a cluster of issues. If you ask 2019 Conservatives today, what are your top issues? You're absolutely right. Cost of living is number one. Immigration is number two. National Health Service is number three. Okay. So voters tend to think about a cluster of issues. The second thing to say, though, is never fall into the trap of thinking that because issues are low salience, because they are down the list of priorities for voters, that they don't care about them. And I'll give you one example. Think about the sexualization of children and the politicization of children in our schools, and the creeping influence of radical progressivism. People say to me routinely, voters don't care about that. Well, look at America and look at Scotland. In America, that issue went from being a non-issue, fringe, marginal, nobody was talking about it, to becoming a top 3 national issue in about 3 years. It was galvanized by campaigns in Virginia, California, and the salience of that issue rocketed. And when it rocketed, people began to take notice of it. Europe, Brexit. I remember journalists lining up in the early 2010s and said, Matt, why on earth are you talking about EU membership all the time, or immigration? EU membership is a low salience issue. But when people started talking about it and debating it, it became one of the most important issues in the country. And the last one was Scotland. I remember everyone said, no one cares about culture wars. You know what happened when Nicola Sturgeon said, let's let 16-year-olds legally change their gender? Voters started thinking, hang on, what are people talking about? They started looking at the question. I polled them. Only 20% of people said, I think this is a good idea. 80% looked at it and said, this is nuts. This is insane. We should not be allowing children to change their gender, even if you think people can change their gender, without any medical supervision and any support. And so salience changes. And how do you change salience? You have political entrepreneurs. You have people, leaders, who are brave enough, courageous enough to turn things that I think many people care about into highly salient political issues. I personally don't think that is divisive culture war politics. My view would be women's rights, the rights of children, free speech, opposing political correctness, how we think about our history, how we think about our national identity. These are the foundations of civilization. They are not culture war questions. They are essential questions. And the fact that we talk about them as though they're culture war questions shows how much territory conservatives have ceded over the last 20 years.
I probably would agree with you on a lot of those things, but I can't help but think that the Labour Party, which hasn't been as strong on a lot of those issues, in fact, are pretty weak on them, are still ahead in the polls despite them. And again, forgive me for hammering the point, but they're still ahead. So, despite Starmer not being able to say 100% of women don't have penises or whatever it was that you couldn't say, they're still, I don't know if it's come down slightly, but they still look on course to win. Do you really think that these issues at the next general election in Britain, which of them, if they can rise in salience, will be significant in the next election?
Immigration, for sure. It's the second issue for 2019 Conservatives, and it's about to become a much bigger issue in British politics as we see net migration rise from 504,000 last year to, depending who you talk about in government, and I talk to a lot of people in the civil service who tell me this week, mid-May 2023, that we're looking at somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million, which is remarkable given that it was 230,000 when David Cameron took office in 2010. Now, why is Labour ahead in the polls? Well, they're ahead in the polls because opposition parties don't win elections, governments lose them. There is no mass public enthusiasm for Keir Starmer, and there was very little public enthusiasm for Labour. This isn't 1997, when all we were talking about was public services and education. This is an electorate that is incredibly weary, angry, frustrated, and is basically saying the country is in such a state, let's let the other guys have a go. If you ask them about these key issues, who can solve the immigration question as one example, the most popular answer is not Labour. It's none of them. There's a massive reservoir of disillusionment over that question. If you ask voters, who do you think can solve crime? Massive amount of disillusionment. Nobody thinks left and right have the answers. And because we're in a majoritarian system, there are no alternatives. Now, if we're in PR, if we had a proportional representation system, we'd have other parties that would be much more visible. But because voters are pushed into one of the two, they have to ultimately make a choice. And this is where I still think, genuinely, I'm happy for people obviously to disagree with me. I think there is so much space right now for something different in British politics that really said to both left and right, you've fundamentally failed over the last 30 years. You failed for economic, which I think is the most un-British thing that has been happening. I mean, the point about woke or political correctness is not that it's a number one issue in the country. It's that it is increasingly pervading everything. So I'll give you an example. I did a project recently. I said to conservative voters, what are the top issues that you care the most about, but which you feel you are not represented on? Okay. The top three: political correctness has gone too far. And as I say to politicians in Britain, don't say woke, say political correctness. Everybody knows what that is. Only about 45% of people know what woke is. Political correctness has gone too far. Immigration is out of control. And we need to do more to protect Britain's distinctive identity, culture, and history. Those are the three issues that conservatives care the most about and feel that they're not represented on. You might also throw crime into that mix. So that raises an intriguing question. What if we actually had a conservative leader of the Conservative Party? What if we actually had somebody who came out tomorrow and said, you know what? I don't want to have an economy built around importing cheap migrant labor for the next 20 years. I don't want to have a country that can't solve the housing crisis while running net migration at 500,000. And I don't want a country that is still falling over itself to invest in London and the graduate class while ignoring everybody else. And I don't want a country that is increasingly exposing our children to an experiment that has no basis in science. That person would be very popular. That person would lose SW1 and London in 2 days. But out there in the wider country, they would be incredibly popular because they would be saying what everybody is basically thinking, which is that this experiment, this liberal revolution, isn't working.
In practical, but rather on the party political side, what do you think the Tories in government can do on the issue of immigration? What policy now, what could they do to convince voters that they're the ones who can actually deal with it, if it's, as you say, one of the salient issues, or do you think it's too late?
I don't think the Conservatives can fix the issue, can fix the problem, and I do think it's a problem. For me, immigration has always been about the political economy, right? It's not about the people. It's the fact that we as a country have now become dependent on a model that is basically driven by cheap workers and consumption, right? And then we sit here and say, well, why is productivity so low? Why are growth rates so low? And why are so many people feeling as though they have no real control and influence over the decisions that are affecting their daily lives? After Brexit, the Conservatives through Boris Johnson they took a conscious decision to liberalise non-European migration. Not many people realised what they were doing at the time, but they basically said, look, we're going to repivot, reposition, and we're going to open the door to record numbers of people from outside of Europe, Nigerians, Zimbabweans, etc., etc. And what we're also going to do is we're going to say to everybody that this is a high-skill immigration policy. We're attracting the best of the best. And then we're going to reduce the salary thresholds for worker visas to £21,000 or £25,000 in most sectors. The average wage in this country is about £33,000. So you're looking at it and you're thinking, well, we're being told we've got a high-skill immigration policy. We're being told that the British people have got control, but we've got a visa program here with salary thresholds which are about 10 grand below the average wage. And also Boris Johnson removed the requirement for British companies to advertise jobs in Britain first. Now that to me does not seem like it was a reasonable, satisfactory response to the Brexit vote. And the worst bit about all of this is they then let open the floodgates on international students and their relatives. Why does that matter? Well, I work in university, so I'll tell you, the whole point of Brexit for many people was to get off this economy that is producing too many graduates when there aren't enough graduate jobs. About a third of graduates aren't working in graduate jobs because there are too many graduates. We need fewer universities and we need to get more kids doing trades You're going to technical colleges, becoming doctors, by the way, because we don't allow enough of them to become doctors or to become medical professionals. And what the government's done is said, no, actually, we're going to keep this broken model going by allowing even more international students into the country in order to keep broken universities afloat, which therefore removes any incentive for universities to invest in building relationships with community colleges and helping apprentices and all the rest of it. And so on all the tough decisions that the Conservatives should have taken, all the difficult choices, they went for the easy option. So they can't solve the migration question. They don't want to solve the migration question. And that's why they're fixated on small boats. And they might be able to slow down the numbers if they get the Rwanda policy working. They might be able, if they're brave enough, to do some things like reforming the Human Rights Act or possibly leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. But I would make a bet with you, Winston, that a year from now, we'll be looking at net migration at somewhere around close to 1 million. We'll probably have had another 70, 80,000 people crossing the channel in the boats. And the politics of immigration, which can often be very divisive and very ugly, and which we really should have put to bed after the Brexit referendum, that they will be back with a bang.
I'm trying to understand why the Tories have allowed this and this immigration to just skyrocket like it has. Is it because they're trying to deal with the population growth decline?
The underlying logic for the Conservative Party, I think, is twofold. One is, and this is what I said at the conference, which is, I think, ruffles some feathers in the Conservative Party, is they've consistently put business before the national community. And that's the reality of the Conservative Party. In the aftermath of Brexit, they face a choice, right? They could have stood up to business and said, we're not going to keep just funneling cheap migrant labour to you to keep your costs down, to keep profits up, and to stop you from investing in British people and developing British skills and innovating and automating and the rest of it. They didn't. They failed. They just said the first real test, they fell over and said, no, we're going to, okay, right, sorry. Simon Wolfson and Next and big business, sorry, okay, you can't get workers. We're going to keep workers coming. Sorry, we'll keep the taps on. So that was the first part of the logic. And the second is, to be frank, most Tories are status conscious Tories. They don't really like to get drawn into cultural disputes over immigration and identity. It's very difficult for them. They don't want to get drawn into the woke stuff, as we saw in response to the NatCon conference, because they think, oh no, it's beneath us. We don't do this. This is culture war stuff, which is why today's Conservatives are actually very different from an earlier generation of Conservatives who were basically aware of the fact that they are custodians of the nation. They're not just here to serve business. They're not just here to drive the economy. That's a massively important part of what they're doing, but they're also here to defend institutions, to pass on a cultural inheritance, and to look after families. And I think at every turn since Brexit, the Conservatives have shown that actually they're not really all that interested in doing those things. They view those things as quite cranky, as quite fringe. And one of the fascinating comparisons to make today is between Britain and Sweden. So why is it that British Conservatives lowered the salary thresholds and basically kept us dependent on low-skill migration, whereas the Swedish Conservatives have just said, we are not going to have low salary thresholds. We're going to keep them at least at the average wage, if not higher, because if people are coming in, then we want them to be high-skilled and we want them to be contributing to the economy. We've not done that. We've done the opposite. And here's something that would, is obviously going to ruffle some feathers and is a bit of a controversial point to make, but I'll make it. A lot of the people who are now coming in under the post-Brexit liberalisation are not going to be contributing anywhere near as much to the national economy as the people who were coming in before. And there are a number of studies now that have shown that low-skilled migrants coming from other parts of the world are going to contribute less to the British economy than, let's say, the French and the Spanish and the Greeks and the Latvians and so on. And this is reflected in our housing system. 60% of social housing in London is going to people who aren't British. And we've got this housing crisis, yet we've got, depending on what estimate you use, a couple of 100,000 homes sitting in offshore tax havens for foreign investors. So this is where the politics of immigration is going. It's going to increasingly be linked to housing. It's going to increasingly be linked to public services, which is why I keep saying to the Conservatives, if you don't get on top of this, you are leaving yourselves wide open to a major challenge, a kind of reconfiguration of the right. This week in Westminster was about the National Conservatism Conference, where there are now serious people, This isn't a fringe thing. Serious cabinet ministers, serious MPs, serious donors, thinkers who are just saying, you know what, this brand of conservative politics has run into a cul-de-sac. It doesn't have the answers to today's problems.
I'd go further. It's been a complete and utter disaster. They've had power for 13 years. Cost of living crisis, migrant crisis, as you described. Douglas Murray, in his speech at the NatCon conference, articulated very well. How can you expect young people to want to play the capitalist game or be capitalists if they're unable to accumulate capital because of the housing crisis? Is the obvious implication there. This has all happened under the watch of the Conservative Party. Over is it 50, something like 53% of households now take more from welfare than they put in. Top 10% of the country pay for over half of income tax. It's a welfare state. This has all happened under the Tories. The only thing I can see that the Tories have achieved in the last 13 years is Brexit. There's nothing. Levelling up has been levelling down, and I don't. It's completely their fault, as you said earlier in this conversation. It's they're losing this.
Well, speaking to you in the Spectator, so I don't need to tell you this, as the Spectator's led the debate on this. But if you just look at what's happened to welfare over the last decade, the irony was that I remember David Cameron and George Osborne, really going after Labour in terms of how many people they essentially encouraged to become reliant on the welfare state, losing dignity, meaning and purpose in their lives. But as we're sat here today, there's close to 5 million people on working age people on benefits. What we've done is we've sort of agreed not to talk about that and fill the holes with migrant labour. So it's a very difficult one, and it's also one that is going to become increasingly visible to everybody over the next 10, 20 years, because the other part of the logic for the Conservative Party, and they're right to worry about it, but they're wrong to berate National Conservatives for talking about it, which is we have a massive demographic crisis looming in this country. We are 2025, I think, is going to be one of the last years where essentially more Brits are going to be dying than being born. And the fertility rate now is already down to about 1.5. So you're basically looking at a welfare state, an economy that over the next 50 years, unless you have large amounts of inward migration or, controversial, you encourage British families to have more children, maybe by having a pro-family tax policy, maybe by having pro-family norms throughout society, maybe actually having a conversation about how we might encourage people to do that. We're going to have lots and lots and lots of more immigration. And that already immigration is the biggest driver of population growth in this country. So over the next 10, 20 years, the country will become visibly very, very different. I mean, by 2060, if you look at the estimates from Oxford, and I just say this to give you a sense of the pace of change, not because I think it's necessarily problematic, but to give you a sense of the change. So by 2060, it's estimated that the percentage of white British citizens will go from around about 80% to about 60%. Which means that in most primary schools by the 2050s or thereabouts, essentially white British kids will be a minority. And so the pace of change is going to be enormous. So what we've seen over the last 20 years is really nothing compared to what we're going to see over the next 20. We're going to add about another 5 million people to the population by 2040, which is like 5 Birminghams. So the population change will be enormous, and our capacity for dealing with that, with infrastructure, health, housing, is going to be tested like never before. So we either come up with a generation of leaders who are realistic about how much migration we can deal with given those challenges, or we try and push forward new people who can at least begin to address some of those problems and raise the conversations about those problems. I mean, the response to NatCon, to the conference, was fascinating in that somebody, so the FT or the New Statesman or somebody said, they're talking about demography and birth rates as if this is like a taboo. I mean, the problem I have with this country is we're not a serious country when we talk about social and cultural problems. Much of the world is talking about the demographic time bomb. Much of the world is talking about aging societies. Much of the world is talking about how to develop pro-family policies. But in Britain, where our national conversation is dominated by social liberals and progressives who will basically use this to try and stain people as being, right-wing or Viktor Orban sympathizers or whatever, we're just not a serious country. We're not even capable of having the policy debates that we need to have in order to solve these problems.
That was actually the two speeches at the NatCon that come to mind were Louise Perry's and Ed West, who were...
they were my favorite speeches.
Yeah, they were prepared to talk about that specific thing. And I really challenge anyone who considers himself different political opinion to disagree with the fundamentals of what they were saying, particularly Louise Perry's argument about supporting mothers. I mean, just forget about all what it means for the identity change of the nation. Just, don't we want to support women? Don't we want to support mothers? It seems like that it was so refreshing actually to hear that being spoken about. Like it's how that's been neglected from British politics is shameful.
It's actually how the family has been neglected. If you look at, we have the highest rates of family breakdown in the Western world, some of the highest. We're on course to have by the end of this decade, the largest number of single parent families in Europe. We already have 43% of kids in this country by the time they turn 18 are no longer living with mum and dad. So we have an enormous family problem. And the reaction, by the way, to some of the speeches at NatCon Online was saying, well, what's the problem with single mothers? Look, I was raised by a single mother, and I said in my speech, my parents divorced when I was 5. So the idea that talking about family breakdown is reactionary, is divisive, is problematic, the people who say that have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. Because if you look at the evidence on family breakdown, and if you want the evidence, go online, Google family inequalities, Nuffield, you can get the report, came out at the end of last year. It is completely comprehensive, and it tells a very consistent picture. Kids who come from broken homes are more likely to do worse in the education system, more likely to be arrested, more likely to pass through prisons and the criminal justice system, more likely to be depressed, more likely to have mental health problems, off the charts in a lot of these things. And by the way, there is actually a significant difference between kids who are raised in a cohabiting couple from kids who are raised in a married couple. There is actually a difference between those two. And I know this is difficult for people to talk about, but it's true. And this is not to take anything away from single mothers. I'm able to say my single mother is one of the strongest, most impressive people I've ever met in my life. But I would still rather have been raised in a 2-parent family. If you look at the evidence, it's overwhelming. I would have done better. I would have been more stable, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to be able to have these conversations, and we need to be able to have them in a way that is reasonable, evidence-led, and say, okay, so what could we do? Well, we could change the way in which we tax families. We could tax them as families, not as individuals. We could change the way we distribute childcare. We could push back against Jeremy Hunt, who clearly views mothers and fathers as economic units who need to leave the home as quickly as possible and get back to work. When all the evidence shows that actually children should really be with their mothers for as long as possible during the first 3 years, if not longer. And we need to be able to have these arguments and take these arguments to the mainstream parties. Mm-hmm. And I just don't see any of the people who are doing that, with the exception of, Miriam Cates, Danny Kruger, and some of the people at the conference who are actually willing to say, we need to be able to talk about the politics of family. Families are not just kind of fluid entities that are defined by anything and everything. We know what a good, stable, productive, successful family structure looks like. And if you even disagree with all of that, and you're a ruthless pragmatist, then just perhaps ponder the fact that having strong families is the greatest return on investment that any society can make. I mean, think of the financial savings and the impact on GDP by having strong, cohesive family units in society. I mean, if you want the rational case for, the economic instrumental case for families, it's there. Mm-hmm. Right? But if you want the moral case, as in actually this is why we should really be talking about it, that's there too. So why don't we actually have a serious discussion about it?
Absolutely. Before we go into the NatCon conference, or we've already gone into it a little bit, some listeners will find both the words nationalist and conservative as they'll have allergic reactions to the words immediately. So before we go into what
Don't use the
happened,
National Health Service.
can you give your? Okay, I mean, like nationalism is conflated with jingoism, the Holocaust, the sins of the 20th century. A lot of them. What can you make the case for nationalism detached from those things, or is it are they right to say that it's attached to those sort of sins?
Yeah, one of my favorite speeches, I mean, all of them obviously are online on YouTube. Things are considered taboo. I don't know of many countries outside of Western Europe that would come close to thinking like that, yet we do. National conservatism, in my mind, is a very distinctive political movement which wants to put the interests of the national community first, which wants to prioritize communities over individuals, and which wants to ensure that families and communities and neighborhoods are promoted and protected from globalization and global interests. And that's why national conservatives are very supportive of lowering immigration. They're instinctively skeptical of large-scale global corporations and business. They want to celebrate the distinctiveness of national identity. They don't just want Britishness or Englishness to be reshaped as a celebration of international diversity and multiculturalism. They're very welcoming of people who are genuinely in need of help, but they're very suspicious and skeptical of people who are seen to abuse the system. And I think it's fair to say that the view of most national conservatives is if you are not embracing British values and respecting British institutions, then you should consider, not living in Britain. I mean, that I think is a fair response. And that's why they've been willing to talk about things that many other people haven't been willing to talk about. They've talked about the sexual exploitation of children through the grooming scandal. They've talked about what's happening in schools where children are being taught there are 72 genders. They're willing to talk about the demographic time bomb, but they're also willing to talk about industrial strategy, how to build an economy that isn't dependent on London, how to drive growth in a serious way that isn't just based around consumption and flooding the market with workers from overseas. They're willing to say, actually, I don't think we should just import doctors and nurses. I think we should expand the number of medical places for British kids so that they can actually become doctors and nurses and go into the healthcare system. And they're willing to say, Tony Blair was wrong. We shouldn't just have a nation full of university degree holders. We should have, a true one nation. We should have apprentices and technical colleges and vocational education producing alternative routes into leading a successful life. And one of the most interesting ideas I heard at NatCon was, well, if you want to discuss reforming the House of Lords, here's an idea. Why don't we have a people's chamber that reflects the different trades and the different skills and the different communities that we have in this country? There's one way of reforming the House of Lords in an interesting way that would send a message that we value work. We see dignity in work. We see meaning in work. And I think there are just many things that we could do in this country that send a very loud signal that the social and economic settlement has changed. I'm not in the book. Obviously, I'm quite critical of Margaret Thatcher. I never say, many of the things Margaret Thatcher did were necessary at the time, but it was a set of answers to a different set of questions. Mm-hmm. And what worries me about the Conservatives today is that they still think they're living in 1988 and they're still providing answers, but to the wrong answers to an old set of questions. And they haven't quite got the right answers to the new questions.
Well, on that, you criticised in your speech at NatCon the ultra-free traders, I think was your term, although you didn't expand on that, and I would be curious what you meant by ultra-free traders.
Yeah, so when you go to go back to the 1990s and the early 2000s, the whole debate about globalization led by Tony Blair, Larry Summers, among others, lots of folks in the European Union, was that globalization, the deregulation of economies, liberalizing finance, increasing free trade, global trade would lift all boats in society. It was a good thing, symbolized by Blair's speech in 2005, where he famously said, if you don't support globalization, if you're not on board, you basically don't understand the world, right? And he essentially said, you're an idiot if you don't get this. What we now know through the work of David Autor, David Dorn, among others in economics, is that the deregulation and liberalization of finance and the opening up of national economies to global free trade had disproportionately negative effects on working class voters in Western economies, especially non-graduate workers in industrial communities that were hit hard by the economic shocks of growing trade with China, and in Britain, in part, trade with other places in Europe. And that did two things. One is it significantly lowered wages and the economic interests of those workers. But crucially, secondly, there are a number of papers now that show it also undermined family stability and undermined the social fabric, so the community fabric, that where you had areas that were suddenly exposed to these big shocks, or that suddenly had a really big influx of cheap migrant workers from Central Eastern Europe as part of this project, it wasn't just that domestic workers lost money, it was that there were higher rates of family breakdown, higher rates of so-called drugs of despair, people turning to cocaine, heroin, alcohol, so-called slow motion suicides, and communities became weaker in many of those areas. And what always irritates me about British Tories and Conservatives and free traders, by that I mean economic liberals who believe passionately that actually we need to do more of that. We need to deregulate.
Which would include Rees-Mogg, who made a speech.
Yeah, partly Rees-Mogg, but we need to basically deregulate, take caps off bankers' bonuses, prioritize the city. What makes me nervous about that is I've never yet heard any of them tell me their view about that evidence, which shows that it not only undermines domestic workers, but damages the fabric of families and communities. So I think there has to be an alternative model that is much more focused at doing what that not first wave of globalization, but what that 90s wave of globalization, 2000s wave didn't do. And it didn't think seriously about how to compensate or prepare the losers of globalization for what was coming. Everybody just said, get on with it. It will be fine. Boats will be lifted. And we now know that it wasn't fine, and that's why support for Brexit was strongest in those communities. It's why support for Farage was strongest in those communities. It's why many of those voters in the Red Wall and elsewhere said, you know what, actually, I can sense, I think Boris Johnson is talking about a different brand of politics from Margaret Thatcher. It sounds like this levelling up thing, this kind of Brexit thing, this kind of lowering immigration thing. To me, it sounds like that's quite different from Thatcher and everything. Now, of course, we now know it wasn't really all that different at all. But many of those wrote a wonderful book recently called The New Class War, in which he says that one of the problems with the managerial professional overclass today is that they will basically denigrate everybody who disagrees with them as, racist, transphobe, lunatic, fringe, cranky, partly to ensure and to try and prevent any serious opposition to the project from emerging. And there are racists in our society and there are transphobes, but most of the people are gloomy, and that's why I think we need to work at reforming and reshaping the institutions to ensure that they get a wider pool of talent